As a leader, when you're building a team, you have a lot to consider. One of those considerations is the personalities of the people which are going to be on your team. Today's guest specializes in speaking specifically about personality diversity. Dr. Nate Reiger is a former practicing psychologist and an expert in social emotional intelligence, interpersonal communication, and leadership. Listen in to hear what Nate has to say about personality diversity.
Welcome to the Leadership Coaching Group's podcast. I'm your host, Liz Howard, an entrepreneur, author, and executive leadership coach. This is where I introduce you to the top experts that discuss the burning topics that leaders at all levels need to know about. My goal is to help you become a leader that you are confident others will want to follow. So, subscribe to the show, listen in weekly, and watch your confidence as a leader grow. Nate, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Liz. It is a pleasure to be here.
You have a new book, and the title is really kind of interesting. It's called Seeing People Through. But what does it actually mean to see someone through?
Well, to see someone through is probably the truest meaning of the word inclusion. Inclusion is way beyond just tolerating diversity or celebrating diversity. It's really about leveraging diversity. And we particularly specialize in diversity of how people deal with conflict and how different personalities communicate. But seeing people through means not only you're appreciating and seeing them for who they are, but you're then with them through the struggles, with them through the growth, with them through the changes. And so I think seeing people through is about being with people in all of that diversity through thick and thin.
And I think this is a good opportunity to back into why you're a great person to listen to with this. So you have studied psychology. Can you talk a little bit about that background of yours? And then I'd love to ask you some more questions about this element of diversity.
Yeah, sure. I grew up the son of missionary parents in Africa, and I was a minority for the most of my life and didn't realize it, didn't appreciate what was happening. I was just one of the kids running around. And growing up in Africa, both in a really rural, tropical kind of setting, and then also in Southern Africa during the 80s, during apartheid, when Nelson Mandela was in prison, I really started to see diversity, discrimination, segregation from a different angle than maybe people that have experienced it in the US. But that really planted seeds in me for there's got to be a better way to connect with people. So I went on to get a degree in clinical psychology because I'm just so fascinated by why people do what they do and how we can connect better. But practicing clinical psychology as a therapist for 11 years, I realized I can't do this. I was drained by the hour by hour one-on-one stuff. I really felt like I wanted to teach and train and coach and consult and meet people. And of course, once I learned about my personality, I realized, yeah, that's what energizes me. I need to be with people in these kind of dynamic, unpredictable settings. But the passion for connecting with diversity has always been there.
That is an incredibly cool story. So let's just pull the string a little bit. So you said you learned about your personality. So how do you define personality? Because the listeners to this podcast have likely had a slew of various assessments and tests. Wow. And, we have letters and animals and colors that have told us about our personality. So what do you have to say about it?
Oh my goodness. I mean, and I learned about all of them in graduate school. I learned about DISC and Myers-Briggs and, some of the more MMPI and the more sophisticated ones. And now there's strengths and there's just so many, like you said. But one of the things that I have really come to realize and learn through research is that personality is really about the stable. There's two parts. There's the stable features that are kind of our temperament, the way we prefer to engage with the world, that really don't change after we're about 7 years old. They're very durable. And then there's the part of our personality that responds to life conditions and is dynamic. And that is really critical to pay attention to also. But most personality models aren't really measuring personality because if you take them again, it changes. And so obviously you're not measuring anything durable. So the model that we use that I've really settled on, process communication model, I like it because it measures both the stable aspects and the dynamic aspects of personality. So at any given time in our lives, we can see what has never changed and what is like currently in flux. This really is generated from mathematical observation of behavior. And, we have the typical, we have the thinker that's very logical and organized. We have the persister that is kind of driven by values and convictions. And we have the harmonizer, which is the compassionate, sensitive one. We have the funster, the rebel, they call it, that's really more spontaneous and creative and playful. We have kind of the promoter, which is my strongest type, which is why I didn't like long, day after day, one-on-one. The promoter is much more wanting kind of action, that dynamic thrill of the chase kind of a life. And then we have the imaginer, the introvert I was talking to you about earlier, that's very much more inside is where all the action is. And so these aren't generalizations. They're very specific behavioral clusters that we can observe within us and around us by watching behavior.
What is important to know if you feel like, especially I think when you're going through a leadership journey, you get tested in different situations and you see yourself in different lights and you have different pressures to, behave in a way that might be accepted in a corporate sort of way, or, the people that get promoted tend to appear to be, I don't know, persisters or whatever it could be.
Sure.
What's important for someone to know when they're kind of able to see personality types and it feels out of alignment with themselves? What does that do to a person?
That is such a good question, particularly when we're talking about leadership. And one of the things I really want listeners to know is that there is no such thing as, your private personality and then maybe your work personality. There is your personality. And either you are in a healthy space and you can move around within your personality and access these different energies, or you're in distress and you're showing very predictable self-sabotaging behaviors. That doesn't matter on what kind of a context you're in. It really matters about whether you're healthy or not. And so what I would want leaders to know about personality is that get to know your personality, because it's like the machine that runs you. And the better you understand how it works, the better you can take care of it and you can maximize its kind of built-in potential. But also, the better you can prevent breakdowns, because breakdowns are unbelievably predictable. They're unbelievably consistent. And every single time they undermine our best intentions.
And so every single, one of my antennas are up right now because it's an interesting thing. So what are some of the kind of predictable self-sabotaging behaviors and some of these predictable kind of bad things that can happen?
Well, these were actually the very first discoveries by Dr. Tabby Kaler, who developed this model. The very first things he discovered back in the 70s was predictable self-sabotaging patterns of behavior when people kind of left their healthy space and started to malfunction. And it was very fleeting, but very easy to see once you know what to look for. And it leads to 6 predictable clusters of behavior. One of them is overcontrolling. That's a typical pattern that gets us in trouble. The second one is pushing beliefs, getting, self-righteous, judgmental. Another one is making silly mistakes where we start to question ourselves and we screw up, not because we're incompetent, but because we lose confidence. A third one is isolation, where we pull away and we disconnect from the world. A fifth one is manipulation, where we start to maneuver and create negative drama. And then the last one is blaming, where we just do everything to avoid responsibility. So these 6 clusters of behavior are responsible for all of the drama and miscommunication and trouble in most of our workplaces. And they are all a function of our personalities when they're in distress.
Okay. So definitely going to take this back to your psychology work here. How on earth, it's really easy to see when other people do this, right? I could point a finger and say oh yeah, this person does that, this person does that. It's challenging to see it in yourself. How have you found that people are successful in identifying these things in the self, and is there hope?
That's a great question, because I don't think any model is useful unless it helps us self-regulate and self-manage. At something as simple as look at the structure of your sentences, look at the length of your emails, and compare them to yesterday. And you can see changes that indicate that you're in distress. Or here's a list of things you can show a trusted peer and ask them, do you see any of these? And if they say yes, that you're not functioning well.
It's rather deep work when you do work on yourself and kind of get to know yourself and just kind of turn the lights on with some of these things. What if you are a leader that's developing someone else and say you see an issue like overcontrolling in someone that you're growing up as a leader? How do you effectively approach that with the intent of helping without causing, a really below the line kind of intense negative interaction?
Well, that's a great question. And it happens so often that leaders want to help, or any of us, parents, leaders, coaches, we see behavior that isn't okay or it's destructive and we want to help. And the first thing we want to do is go mention the behavior. We want to point it out. And when we're talking about distress behavior, that is like absolutely the worst thing to do. That would be like when your car runs out of gas and the empty light goes on, that you want to go comment to your car that the empty light's on. It's like, duh. The solution is not to talk about the light being on. The solution is to put gas in the tank. So the best thing leaders can do is realize that most negative behavior is a symptom of an unmet positive psychological need. And when they can make those connections, they can intervene not by trying to control the behavior, but by meeting the unmet need and filling the tank so that the warning light goes off. And that's a complete game changer for most leaders because they're not used to spending their energy that way.
And I can just hear the questions right now. So it's like, I hear you, Nate, but this guy is derailing because he has I happen to know he's going through a divorce or whatever it may be. And that seems so outside of the circle of work. So I don't know how to fill that tank. Like, what do you do then?
The tank filling, which is the psychological needs for each of the 6 types, those are things any leader can do, any friend can do, any teacher can do. Now, we cannot control another person. We cannot force a person to come out of distress or to receive the gift or the offer that we give them. We can do the best that we can. And of course, we still have to talk about behavior at some point, because if the behavior is threatening a deadline, or it's putting a project at risk, or it's putting, a child at risk, then of course we have to deal with it. But this is why you're right. This can be deep work. And most leaders, what I didn't say is that we also have to put our oxygen mask on before we try to help the person in the seat next to us. And so making sure that our stuff's under control and then we've got our stuff in order is critical first. Otherwise, we're out there trying to help people and we're just making things worse.
So sometimes we've done a really good job in our field, right? We are able to get promoted and then, oh my gosh, we got promoted again and it's kind of cool. And then it happens again and it's scary because now all of a sudden I have these crazy people issues. I'm no longer the expert in what I do and nobody even wants to talk to me about that anymore. What do you do when you are promoted beyond the level of your people skills?
Yeah, that's kind of my new definition of the Peter Principle is you promote people to their level of their incompetence around people skills. Just today, I was talking to a vice president of a large multinational company, and she was telling me how their company has a lot of engineers and medical professionals, and they're all super smart. And they get promoted, and she said, they get promoted and they can manage projects, but they can't manage people. And that's where everything falls apart. So I think we just have to first recognize that we didn't get this training in school. We were promoted because of our technical skill, but our new job requires us not to do the same work that we did before, but to help others do that work. And so just recognizing that and then investing and learning and being open to appreciating the value of people skills right now is something that every leader, I think, can benefit from.
It's interesting because a lot of my work is as a coach is within heavy science research and development, big companies. And here's an interesting thing that I've seen happen time and time again. And I'm interested to hear how you would address it is sometimes you get a lot of pushback when someone is promoted to a leadership role that in fact does not have the same technical depth as some of the workforce might, but they do have experience with people leadership. But the immediate resistance is you don't possibly understand what we do. You haven't been here. You don't get the technology. You don't get the science. you're not one of us, essentially, right? And the interesting thing is that sentiment, I don't know which direction it flows, maybe both, but oftentimes I've seen it also kind of echoed from very high levels of an organization. So how do you help create a safe space and comfort for people to, or maybe for a leader to enter that type of environment and then sort of be a presence of, effectual presence and positive presence when there's so much negative resistance?
Gosh, Liz, I love your question. And it invited me to remember something I haven't thought about for 20 years. When I did my internship out of graduate school, I was at the VA Medical Center in Tacoma, Washington. And one of my rotations was with inpatient addictions treatment for veterans that were dealing with addictions and PTSD. And I'm a young, 27-year-old studying, learning book knowledge about addictions. And I come sit in this therapy group, and this is the first time I've ever been in here, and I'm an intern. And one by one, everyone asked me, they said, "So, are you an addict? Are you in recovery? Because if you're not, you don't mean anything to us. You have nothing to offer." And it was like an incredibly intimidating and scary experience of kind of what you're talking about. It's like, no, I don't have your skill. And I think there's really only one way to deal with that, which is to get curious and to be open. Nobody's expecting you to be perfect. And I think they want to hold that knowledge against you until they know if they can trust you and if you really care and if you're really curious. And I think leaders with good people skills that care and are curious can overcome massive deficits in their technical knowledge.
Perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's sort of a personality thing about how we develop that psychological safety. So it could be different for me than it would be for you, but the fact of the matter is we want to feel safe.
I think you're right. And I'm a big fan of the work of Frederick Miller and Judith Katz. They wrote a book called Safe Enough to Soar. And it's about this concept of interaction safety, which is really the next level beyond psychological safety. It's really like, are we safe to interact? And leaders that create a safe place for people to interact have their credibility goes through the roof. That's the kind of leaders everybody wants. And I think that is much more important than your particular industry expertise or technical expertise, because you can learn that.
So what is it that people do that kind of hinders that safety to interact? Because I think that's huge. And I think that especially right now, we really, really need that in so many ways. So what are leaders doing to take away from that?
I'll tell you, one of the biggest hindrances to interaction safety is if you're not curious. It's as simple as asking someone a rhetorical question when they already know that you don't care about the answer. That ruins it right there. Or even worse, this happens in most of my family reunions. My wife and I joke about this all the time. Someone you haven't seen for a long time comes up and asks you how you're doing or what's going on, and they don't even listen to the answer, or you give an answer and you know it was just a setup for them to talk to you about the thing they wanted to talk about. So it's the second and third and fourth questions that really let people know that you care and you're curious. So I think that's one thing we can do to undermine it. Another thing is, from a personality perspective, is that we get so into our own frame of reference in our perceptual world that we just think everybody sees the world that way and should understand what we're saying. And so we don't appreciate how we come across, or appreciate that maybe we need to vary how we deliver the message so that different people can hear it.
Interesting. Is there anything else that you would say is key to know if you want to really help bolster interaction safety?
Yes. Well, I do. My other passion is compassion at work. And my other book that I wrote before this one is called Conflict Without Casualties. And it's all about compassion in relationships and conflict. And here's the one thing: disclose your motives. How many times have you been asked a question, but you know that there's something behind it? Or maybe somebody wants to give you feedback, but you don't know why they're giving you feedback. And it can be as simple as me calling my, support person and saying, "Hey, will you run those reports by 5 o'clock this afternoon?" And they're sitting there wondering, why does he want them by 5 o'clock? Why is it so urgent? But what if I disclosed my motives and said, hey, I'm getting ready for a board meeting. I'm really anxious about being on top of the numbers and I'd like to review them tonight. Will you run them by 5 o'clock? It's like, oh, totally. Of course I will. I want to help you be prepared for that meeting. So I think very often leaders withhold their motives, or they're not even aware that they're hiding the true reasons for engaging people. And so we don't let people know what we're struggling with. And so how can they struggle with us and help us if we don't let them know?
And it's kind of, just to bring it full circle, I think that that's kind of like allowing people to see you through, right? So if you're a leader and you want to see others through, it's almost giving people the opportunity to see you through also, and to support you and to manage up and to help achieve the mission of the organization, right? But it is kind of like a two-way street.
Liz, that's brilliant. That's exactly what it's about. Because if you really study the word compassion, it means to struggle with, not to struggle for or instead of. It means to struggle with. And when we look at like burnout in medicine right now, what we're seeing is that physicians are actually struggling with empathy fatigue because they take on too much and they do too much for people. But when they start engaging patients as like participants in the healthcare journey and start disclosing how they're feeling and asking for help, that's true compassion. And all of a sudden they start to get energized. We're in it together. I love that you brought that up.
I think it's something that we create as a very challenging element of leadership. And I think that there's been a lot of conditioning around leadership that makes it that much harder, at least in the past. It might be changing a little bit to invite people into that for a lot of us, not for everyone. But I think that that's something that many have really struggled with, to say, I'm struggling, or this is hard, or I feel a little bit out of my element. And why do you think that is?
That's a great question. And we see that a lot. Thank goodness. I think one of the greatest outcomes of COVID is it's starting to break down those walls and force us to get vulnerable with each other. But yeah, I mean, we've been working with leadership teams for a long time, and we'll ask the members of the team, like the employees, hey, if your leader came to you and said, I'm struggling with this, or I need your help, or I'm not too certain, how would it affect your view of them? And without exception, employees are like, oh, that'd be awesome. We'd love to know what they're struggling with because we're in this together. Then we ask the leader, could you see yourself doing that? And they say, oh, no, that would be weak. That I'm not going to show my cards, blah, blah, blah. And so there's this huge hypocrisy or dichotomy between how leaders think they're supposed to act and how their employees actually want them to act. So I think we just need to break down some of those barriers and stop thinking that being open and transparent means you're weak. That takes incredible courage, and it means you're engaging your people to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I think I heard a study that basically reflects exactly what you said, but it was something along the lines of, what's the number one way to gain the trust of an organization as a leader? And the answer was simply asking for help. And as I've presented that to some, pretty tenured leaders, that it's just so fun to watch their body language, because it's like,
what?
Yeah, none of that.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, Nate, I have one question that I like to ask all of my guests, and that simply is, if you had just one piece of advice to offer to a brand new leader, what would it be?
I would say the one piece of advice I would have for new leaders, especially leaders that are wanting to go to the next level, is that it is more important to be effective than to be right. When you can let go of needing to be justified, your effectiveness can go through the roof.
I love that. Where's the best place for people to find you?
seeingpeoplethrough.com. That's the place to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Liz. One of our strategic goals is to partner with other voices to raise the tide of compassion in the world. And you're doing that. And so I really appreciate this opportunity.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. All right, guys, that is all for this week. Until next time, bye-bye.
Hey guys, if you're getting anything out of this show, please head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. I read every single one, and honestly, your feedback is single-handedly what keeps this show going. So go to iTunes and let us know you're listening. Thank you so much for being a part of our community.